Ms. Martin, you worked on, you had a lot to do with the 21CP Solutions report as a consultant. You were extremely familiar with its recommendations. One recommendation identified the need to develop a crime-fighting approach that includes the community. How do you do that in Black and brown neighborhoods where trust between the community and police has been missing for a very long time?
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. And I actually, maybe later on, I actually transitioned out, or I should say that, it sounds like I got rid of the commissioners. I was through 3 commissioners in Baltimore City. And I also was through 3 mayoral transitions. And so not only do you have the unsteady ground, but you have people jockeying, you have people hiding things in desks, you have all sorts of things that are going on both in the police department and the mayor's office that can make that transition even more difficult, and the things in the city don't stop. Those things continue to go. But I will say that to your question.
Before you move to the question, any advice given that for this mayor and the superintendent? Is there any way to address that?
Yeah, so I think, what you're doing right now, well, let me back up. So, what I've seen so far from both the interim chief and the mayor-elect is that it seems like they're good at showing up. And so often, that is the first issue. Like Chief said, if you don't show up with leadership, then people make up their own leadership. If you don't show up in community, people either, make up their own stories, or their stories continue to be perpetuated without an opposite, or an intervening thought there. Same thing with police departments. And so I think, first of all, showing up is important, and they're going to go in. What I've heard about the interim chief, just like in the community, there's some support in the rank and file. It appears that he shows up. He stands behind his word. And again, I don't know him. I'm saying this is from what I've just been able to see. And then the same thing for the mayor. The mayor also seems very transparent and very communicative. And so all of that sounds very basic, but oftentimes in both police departments, I've worked in the police department and the mayor's office. And in both of those places, people have silos. They don't share information. They assume that other people know what the other folks know, that those people are talking to the community. So I think the first thing that you have to do is start showing up, having those conversations, building that trust. Like the mayor said, there is a Miss Jackson in every neighborhood who is out there, who knows what's going on, who's looking out the window. If you're not greeting her, if you're not saying what's going on, how can I help you, when a shooting occurs or something occurs in that neighborhood, Miss Jackson will not be talking to you. And I know here, just like it is in Baltimore, it's already an intimidating instance. First of all, when a police officer comes and knocks on your door and want to have that conversation. And one of the things I always say, and the mayor hit on this, is often in police departments you have a cadre of police folks who are the community police, right? And everybody loves them. And I always say that community policing is not only patrol's job, it's the detective's job. It's those people that hold the homicide scene, because if you are disrespectful to the community when you're holding a homicide scene, what do you think is going to happen when the detective comes back and opens their pad and says, "Man, what happened here? I don't know you. I don't have anything to say to you." And so those are the types of things that I think are going to be important to continue to show up.
Sure. And communications, as you're suggesting too.
Yep.
So I asked you sort of 2 parts. The second part was, what do you do to build, you sort of started to talk about, what do you do to build or rebuild trust in Black and brown communities where there's been such a long history? What are the steps that need to happen?
So the first part is showing up. I'll tell you, I grew up in Texas, and I moved to Baltimore and was there in the mayor's office in the police department for over a decade. And when I left, I had activists who would never used to come even in the police department. First off, I meet them in the community, and then eventually they would come to the police department, but they would come through the back door. And then I remember I had an activist there. We were talking about police reform. He needed to use the bathroom. He was a grown 50-year-old Black man. And when I said the bathroom was down there, he said, "Chief, I'm not going to the bathroom without you." And it really underscored how, and I didn't go in the stall, but I walked him to the bathroom, and that underscored how deep his distrust and his fear was to be in the police headquarters and not go to the bathroom. But when I left, I had both the president of the union calling me, saying, Ganesha, we can get your job back. I was like, no, Gene, I quit on purpose. It's okay. And then, but activists who we now text, I love you, what's up, how you doing? And so, again, showing up consistently, working with the community. What is it that you need? Don't show up and tell you, I'm going to do this, or you need to do this. Show up and listen, and actually take what the community is saying. Listen to the rank and file as well, right? Those voices need to be heard. Come up with a plan that takes into consideration everybody's lived experience, put metrics to it so that you can hold people accountable and continue to show up. Even when doors close, even when people doubt you, even when people say to your face, I don't believe you, you represent the government, y'all never done anything for me, and you're not gonna do anything. Eventually, if you keep showing up and you keep proving, and that middle child hope continues, but there's actually action behind it, you can have the community come together, but it's not gonna happen overnight.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, in her sixth semi-annual report, the independent monitor for the consent decree has continued calls for the Chicago Police Department to develop a cohesive community engagement strategy. What's your reaction to that critique, and can you share what community policing has looked like in other cities, and what does it take to do community policing authentically?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, you gave me a very generous promotion when I was at the Department of Justice. I did not run the Civil Rights Division. I was chief of the Special Litigation Section, which was one of 10 sections in the department, but I appreciate the very gracious promotion. We'd love to have that job someday, but it seems
We'll work on that.
We'll work on it, but thank you. So I think that when we think about the questions before us today and listening to the mayor, it occurs to me that often we conflate a variety of different conversations into a single conversation. And it's worth, and they overlap to a very profound degree and relate to the question you've asked me. It's worth disaggregating those a little bit. There's an important question about what does the law require police officers, how do police officers behave? And that is the question that is most central to what happens inside a consent decree. Consent decrees are really designed to ensure that police departments engage in activities that are within the laws and the Constitution. There's a very important question for communities around what is just. How is it that police officers should behave, and how should interactions between members of the community and members of law enforcement unfold in a way that reflects the values of the community in a just way. And we see that conversation often around the accountability of police officers and what happens during traffic stops, what happens during the stop and frisk and other sorts of things that may be within when you read the Supreme Court precedent of what police officers can and can't do, the protections of the Constitution are actually quite stingy and not what the community actually sees. It should be reflected in the behavior of police officers. And then there's the very important overlapping question about public safety. Who gets to define public safety? How is it co-created with the community? And while those things all overlap very profoundly, there's really significant differences between those two in terms of how those things get implemented. And so when we talk about sort of building community trust, doing it within the question of what is lawful police officers to do is very different than the questions around justice and how you co-create public safety. And I think about this in the context of some of where I am in the District of Columbia. We've got, like every other city, there are portions of our community where public safety is a very significant problem because of long underinvestment in those communities and the kinds of pressures and oppressions that occur in those communities. I'm thinking particularly about conversations now that are going on in our public housing communities, where you have one group of tenants that sue the Public Housing Authority for failure to provide protection, and another group of communities, residents that have sued the Public Housing Authority for putting cameras on the property for surveillance. And that is because we've given, and I think about a conversation I had with a mother in public housing some years ago who said to me, I've got this choice. It's a terrible choice. I can live in a community where I fear for my safety, or I can call the police and fear for the safety of my son. And And that's a choice I don't want to have, because and that's the only choice we give people living in unsafe communities right now. We don't go to those communities and say, what are your assets? What is your solution? What's the role that police should play? What is the role that other institutions should play? And what is the power that you have? Because there's a lot of power in all communities and a lot of capacity in all communities to co-produce public safety with the adequate sort of resources and investments in the authentic partnership and engagement, not just meeting with communities and saying, tell us what you think, and then take it back to the policymakers to decide, but using the power that exists in those communities to actually bring about those changes and to direct those investments that will really create public safety in those communities. I don't see a police officer in my neighborhood unless one of my neighbors calls because somebody keeps running the stop sign. And that's because in my community, people have enough to eat, they go,
Right.
and that's
That sort of relates to what the mayor-elect was saying about, community policing is only discussed when it's in black and brown neighborhoods, and so,
right.
so.
Right, I remember.
It's a special thing for black and brown.
I remember when I was in Department of Justice, I held a town hall, one of the cases I was working on, and we talked a lot about community policing. I actually don't use that word anymore because I don't think anybody knows what it means. And a young woman came up to me, a young black woman, very angrily, this will never leave me. And she says, in the white neighborhood, you don't have to go to a barbecue not to shoot my brother. And that's right. I mean, it's not an activity. It's a value, and it's a practice that should happen in communities. And it is not that the way that we think about community policing as a community policing units, or that I'm doing community policing now and because by going to a barbecue or a public meeting or something like that, rather than every interaction you have being one that's based on a measure of procedural justice.
Great, thank you. I'd like to maybe come back to you, Chief Beck, for this next question, but if the others want to respond as well. And if, I don't know if you have anything you want to add in terms of what you've heard just now, but staffing is obviously a big issue, and the mayor-elect touched on that. The Chicago Police Department has historically concentrated staffing deployment decisions in the hands of one or two people as a means of maintaining political superiority or command staff, politicians, and the rank and file. At the same time, the consent decree requires the Chicago Police Department to conduct a staffing study. How do you upend this culturally authoritative system and achieve the change the consent decree calls for?
Well, the Chicago Police Department, when I first came to Chicago, I had done staffing obviously in Los Angeles, which is a bigger city, and I was shocked by the way CPD did and does staffing. A lot of it is because of, I'll be frank, aldermanic privilege and the desire for aldermen and alder people to have equal staffing in all districts. And in other places that don't have the luxury of 13,000 police officers, you can't have equal staffing in all districts. You have to staff based on need. And need is determined by number 911 calls, amount of crime, the travel distance within that district, because of size, the population of the district, and a lot of things that go into how many cops you need in a neighborhood. And so in LA we have a staffing formula that comes out every 28 days and tries to achieve the right balance of number of cops per the 21 divisions that we have. And we shift resources based on either the time of year or the staffing formula. So CPD needs to do, it needs a staffing study. That needs to be completed, it's really important. And then needs to look at it and make hard decisions, because some districts are going to lose cops. And some districts are going to have more cops, and they're going to need more space.
And that's politically toxic in a city like Chicago, of course.
Oh yeah. I
Probably,
was, because I'm come from a different place, and I was shocked that aldermen would call me and say, hey, you had, 4 cars loaned from my district, from District 16, and you put them in 11 last weekend. And I said, well, I needed to. That's what I had to do. and they said, well, you can't do that. Well, and they would wave budget over your head and things like that. And I would say, well, I won't be here for the budget, so so I'm going to have to do this the way that I think is what makes the city safest. And if I have to move resources to address the threat, or to address, something as, address the weather, a good sunny day, you know where you're gonna need cops, you're gonna move them. And yeah, does that take away from other neighborhoods? Yeah, but.
Sit down eating donuts, nothing like that.
That's not the goal, but the goal is to keep the city as safe as you can. So yes, they have to learn how to balance deployment. They have to put, and I'll say it again, they absolutely have to put resources in the hands of those few people that are accountable to the neighborhoods. In other words, those district commanders are absolutely accountable to people in the neighborhood. And they need to have optimized resources, and more resources, I'm saying, so that they can meet those needs. Because the narcotics commander or the chief of detectives, or the centralized detectives, is not near as accountable to the community as that district commander. So you have to push those resources in there. And then you can start having a conversation about true deployment. Because just fixing the way that the structure is now, by spreading cops around a little bit, that's not the true fix. The true fix is a structure that reflects the need to have a strong relationship with every community in every district. And that's the goal. That's the holy grail of police deployment. And then you figure out, how many people you have in each district.
Okay, well, I want to get you, Ms. Martin, just a quick follow-up. You mentioned aldermanic privilege, so that hasn't gone away despite our current mayor's efforts to end that. As long as aldermanic privilege is in place in Chicago, can any of these other things you're suggesting happen?
Report them.
You need a strong superintendent, one that will listen and make adjustments when it makes sense, but stand his or her ground when it doesn't.
Yes, yes.
And this is the way I describe it is that to be a superintendent or a chief of police, you have to understand politics and work with politics, but you can't be a politician. You can overlook the political pool, but you can't get in it. Or the community will suffer because you will be more beholden to one than another, or you will answer the loudest voice. And that's no community in Chicago or any other city deserves that kind of police.
Ms. Martin.
Just a couple of things of what she said. One on the workload study. Generally, for folks in the audience who are not familiar with that, you look at your calls for service, and that tells you how many officers you need in a district at certain times. One thing that I want to point out is you should also take into consideration that, and it's very hard with staffing levels the way that they are, but also take into consideration that amount of time you want proactively spent in the community. So that you have to be able to build in, again, very difficult when you don't have the appropriate staffing, but you want to be able to build in the time to build in those relationships. So you want to operationalize, and I hate community policing too. We all got to come up with a much better word. It's so bastardized at this point, but and skewed. But you got to take the values that the community has articulated, that the rank and file has articulated, and build that into the operations. And that's one of the things that I think is important about the 21 CP report. If you read the report, some of the things probably sound basic. Like, yeah, you need policies and protocols and accountability mechanisms, But when you hear the mayor talk about showing up to work and not knowing who your supervisor is, like imagine that in your life, right? If your kids didn't know the rules, they probably pretend like they don't, but if your kids don't know the rules, if your boss is telling you something completely different every day that may be different than what's written down, and plus you're in a job now with your life is on the line every day, or you're showing up to places where people are losing their lives, babies are losing their lives, and you have that type of chaos as a human being, how are you functioning? Not very well. And so some of the basic things to the point of the new mayor, a new superintendent, and it is what is the basic structure. When you talk about staffing, I was the chief of staff to the police commissioner. I sat right next to his office. People would come and knock on my door. Chief, such and such got 10 last week. Can I get 5? Or, they'll catch a commander in the hallway. Those sorts of things. Those sorts of things. If you don't have the communication, if your protocol and your procedures are not clear, and you're not holding people accountable, and you can have those type of conversations, then these sorts of things will continue to perpetuate. And I'll say one last thing that I think is important when you don't concentrate all that power on where resources are placed or who's actually promoted and those sorts of things, is we put together a staffing stat. And some of the things that we found out were that you had a black commander in place who had a very high level of education. And anytime he saw a black person that had a lower level education, his own bias came out, and that, we can't hire that person. We had our psychological testing. A lot of people focus on that. When we looked at the process, found out they were asking, did you grow up in a single parent household? Why are you asking that, and who does that disadvantage, right? And so once you even put these policies, protocols, and procedures, and you hold people accountable, and you communicate them, and you're transparent about them, you still need to, on a regular basis, look at those systems and the people that occupy those places so that they're actually serving the rank and file in the community.
Nice.
John Smith, did you want to add anything?
Very, very briefly, just to build on what the chief said, it's not only where we deploy officers, but what we ask them to do. And thinking about the question of call for service, all around the country, police departments are so driven by the calls for service. And the calls for service end up, when you look at, see patterns in other places, I don't know about Chicago, but you see patterns in other places, calls for service tend to come from privileged communities, and the calls are about people of color. And when you allow calls for service to drive all of the police activity, the racial bias that's embedded in community perceptions, who's privileged to call police, ends up driving the bias in the way that police service is delivering. And you end up with the phenomenon of communities really feeling like they are over-policed and underserved. And so, in addition to the sort of where people are, what they do, and how you respond to, if you're mapping this, there's really good data out there, you map this, rapidly gentrified neighborhoods where you've got white communities moving in historically black neighborhoods, you've got massive calls for services come from those neighborhoods that drive a lot of enforcement activity against young black men who are doing nothing other than sitting on a corner. And being able to try to figure out how you address that in the context of your staffing and how you assign people, what activity you ask people to do, the sort of culture of the department about how you address those calls, all are incredibly meaningful, particularly in a period where you've got staffing shortages and proactive kinds of policing activities become more challenging.
Let me add a little bit to that because I hope that I was more clear. A true staffing model has, the LA staffing model has 20 criteria, and one of them is calls for service. And you have to overlay calls for service with crime data, with violent crime data, because violent crime requires much more resources than property crime. You have to overlay this with other things I talked about, population and size and travel distance and all of that, and adjacent policing resources that can be used and that kind of thing. So if it's done right, it's a very complicated formula, and we still, over you know, but not by a long, but it takes a specific reason. You have, you know, serial murder working or serial rapists in the neighborhood. Well, they're gonna get more staffing because we know that we need presence. So, anyway.
And people in the community understand that, especially if you're communicating and explaining it to them. So, I want to move to the audience questions, and we have several really excellent ones that we'd like to share. I'm going to start with one from an anonymous CPD officer, but then we're going to have several from folks that were now in the audience. But this first one comes from an anonymous officer, and I wanted to address it to you, Ms. Martin. As a 4-year member of Chicago Police Department, I would argue that our emphasis on, quote, building trust between the police and the community, unquote, diverts attention and resources from the true issue of our day, problematic police culture and the dangerous idea of the thin blue line. In my law class in the police academy, I learned about the exclusionary rule and the fruit of the poisonous tree. From my humble perspective, as one of the most junior rank and file members of this department, no policy, training, or consent decree can bear positive fruit when the tree of policing, meaning the culture of the fraternal brotherhood of policing, is allowing the poisonous elephant to be in the room. What attention is being put on improving police culture from the inside, rank and file, up to superintendent? And this is not necessarily aimed at Chicago, but where have you seen this work? And can you share any notable success stories?
Yeah, well, I wish he wasn't anonymous, or he or she wasn't anonymous, because, you know, I think the mayor, you know, talked about this earlier, and certainly we're seeing this across the country, where people are having to give $50,000 signing bonuses in some places to even get people to consider, and people still are not applying. But for those who are showing up, many of them want to be the change that they're asking for in the world. And it sounds like, you know, that person that person could be one of those leaders. But the issue is that person sent that question to you. Who can that person ask within the CPD?
Nice.
Who is their lifeline? What is their space and place to be able to create that culture that they're looking for in the police department? And this is one of the things that I won't call it controversial, but it's not something that's talked about very often in policing, which is, you know, your basic criteria is you have to have a good policy, which you'd be surprised out of the 18,000 police departments in America, some of them have not changed their policies since the 70s. So that sounds basic, but it's real. Then you have to have training. I will tell you that the training in policing is very poor. You don't have a space and place for research and development for policing. And I just got through having a conversation with an academic who was very upset because there's no evidence that CIT, which is the training that you give for people in mental behavioral crisis for police, is working. And I said, let me tell you what happens in policing. So there's a new thing that comes out that somebody got a grant for. You know, somebody creates it. The police department looks back. All the rest, okay, they didn't blow up. They didn't get in trouble. Okay, we'll do it. And then this is what's done for 20 years. Not rigorously tested. So, you know, you have to have that training and then that accountability. And even though those things are difficult, those are the basic. The big piece that is missing is the human-centered function. If you cannot, all of us, I think we're probably all great people in this room, but if you take us and you put us through a police academy and tomorrow, we're showing up later today for a man who beat his wife into a pulp, a baby who somebody has killed, a drug overdose. When police don't get called to bat mitzvahs and celebrations, they get called on your absolute worst day. And I give this example of you've gotten into a fight with your spouse or whomever, somebody you love, and that fight replays every 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes, every day. And there is no interventions in policing right now that account for what that does to you as a human. And then you're still taking those people and then put them in the community and say, be their social worker, be what they need. And so I think that we have to look at the way the policing, and this report talks about it, we've got to dismantle kind of the paramilitary organization where voices are suppressed, where innovation is suppressed. We've got to bring in the right people and give them the place to grow. Those answers, that that culture is in the police department. It's just being suffocated right now. And we've got to create the space that those young people and those that are thinking that way can actually, and it has to happen inside, and then the politicians and the community on the outside have to create it. Exactly.
Thank you very much. Mark Wallace has the next question. Is Mark with us in the audience? Mark Wallace? No, so we'll go ahead, I'll go ahead and ask for him. This question is to you, Chief Beck. What are your thoughts on the future of Chicago Police Department's promotion process? Specifically meritorious promotions and the decision to suspend the practice during your tenure as interim superintendent.
So, this actually goes to the last question too, because a department that has a promotional process that is seen as a patronage process, which is what the merit promotion system is a patronage system, discourages promotion of diversity within the department, because it's a good old boys system where people are recommended for promotion regardless of what they scored on the test. And it creates a web of connections between those that are promoted that suppresses individual thought, because everybody is beholden to somebody for their promotion. And so because of that debt, they will not stand up and say what they need to say. So merit promotions to me are, matter of fact, when I looked at the system and I came into Chicago, I said, well, there's an easy win. I will stop doing those. But what I did was I called the then union president and I said, I have a gift for you. And that gift is I'm going to suspend merit promotions. Why don't you support me in doing that? And
He was one of them.
he did. And that's the kind of way that you build bridges with your
Nice.
union. You give them a win. I was going to do it anyway. But you give them a win, and that's how you get the support of your rank and file.
Sweet.
By showing that, hey, we're not just promoting people who know somebody or who worked in my office or, worked on the 5th floor or have other connections to those that have rank. We're going to support people who take a test and do well on that test and then pass the background that's associated with that test, and then we're going to promote them based on their score. And so, there's it digs so deep into the whole core of what's not working on so many levels. It hurts morale, it hurts the ability of the department to perform, and it makes people feel that they are part of an unfair system. And I have a handful of things that I think are always true about policing, and this is one of them. Is the way the department treats their officers is the way their officers treat the public. And if you treat them, and so you can't ask them to treat the public better than you're treating them.
Right. Thank you. The next question, we hopefully have time for a couple more questions, comes from Cara Hendrickson from Impact for Equity. Is Cara with us? Yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. We've talked about building trust with the community this afternoon, and my question is about traffic stops. Impact for Equity and the Free to Move Coalition recently released a report about the use of traffic stops by the Chicago Police Department called the New Stop and Frisk. The report finds that the number of traffic stops in Chicago is increasing and that they are not promoting public safety. And so my question for the panel is, are traffic stops a problem in building trust between police and the community?
I'd like to give that one to Jonathan Smith.
Sure. So this is a national conversation around traffic stops. Traffic stops are both inherently dangerous and they are, Philando Castile got stopped something like 45 times in the 2 years prior to the time he got killed. They are, for both officers and for people who are stopped, particularly black people, every one of those traffic stops is dangerous. And there's a real question about whether or not particularly a large number of traffic stops are for the purposes of somehow enforcing a traffic law that is necessary to make the road safe, or whether that traffic stop is a pretext in order to run somebody's ID or to be able to search their car or search the person or the individual. So around the country, you've seen a movement to get police out of the traffic enforcement business, and that either through having traffic enforcement done by people who don't carry guns, or by doing it, excluding traffic stops from the kinds of things that people can be stopped for altogether, or doing some sort of enforcement by mail or other sorts of mechanisms. It's both to get rid of the pretext stop problem and to reduce the risk that a traffic stop for a fairly minor public safety benefit with a very, very high risk to the individuals being stopped. And, you know, having worked in a lot of jurisdictions and as a reviewing police departments, and when you watch a lot of car cam and body cam video of traffic stops, the terror of black people when they're stopped is just palpable. And it's for very little benefit. And it is often for a purpose that is other than in the fact that the person may have a tail light out, or they stopped a little bit too far in front of the line, or they ran a stop sign. It's often because there's the officers looking for an opportunity to encounter that person for some other law enforcement purpose. And that just creates real danger for everybody, and it erodes trust in the community. When you just see the fear of being, if I roll down my window, what's going to happen to me? If I get out of the car, what's going to happen to me? People with their hands on the dashboard. It's a traumatic experience that is unnecessary to make our roads safe. And so that's why you see there's an ordinance in Philadelphia that prohibits the Minneapolis consent decree. Minneapolis folks here, limits the number of occasions in which officers can pull somebody over. There are other ways to address equipment violations and minor traffic violations that are safer.
Thank you.
Just really quick, this is a perfect place to use the consent decree. This is probably surprising to a lot of people in the audience, but there's not a lot of police departments have antiquated technology, so they have bad data, and they don't have data from the community, but I just lost my, so,
Consent decree.
come back, because I was trying to speak so fast. What consent, this is important. The consent, so the consent decree you can use for, you have to have that data. So you have probably folks that work for you, data scientists, people that were able to look at the data and kind of see the outcomes. That doesn't happen in police departments. When you have a consent decree and stops are part of your consent decree, leverage that to hire the data scientists, the people that you need, and able to take that data and see that when you stop black males between 19 and 34, you don't have your hit rate is low. You're not actually getting that contraband. I did that in a city for 4 years, and eventually, once you got that data, then you start training to that data, and then you start seeing that behavior change. But those type of mechanisms are not natural in police departments, and you can build that when you have a consent decree.
Did you want anything?
I'll just add, I'll be real brief. A lot of this comes from false expectations from supervision. You know, when your supervisor is saying, hey, I need 5 shakes and 4 traffic stops today, well, then guess what they're gonna do? So one of my other actions for policing is be careful what you ask for, because you're gonna get it. So, you know, this is departments unable to separate outcomes from outputs. In other words, what your traffic plan should be is to have less traffic accidents and safer roads, not to create more citations. So that's how you should grade people, not on number of citations, but the number of accidents on every.
Great point. We have time, just a couple minutes just for one last question from Jose Abance. Is Jose with us? Yes, sir. Please stand and bring the mic up, please. Yes, sir. Stand up. Okay. There you go.
All right, so understanding the historical context of policing, particularly in Black and brown communities, Establishing a foundation on which mutual trust can be developed must be intentional. It is impossible to build trust with the community, especially communities most impacted by negative police practices, without changing the department's approach to problem solving and engaging with the community. Ms. Martin stated that officers should have more time to proactively interact with the community. Please expound on what things beat officers should be required to do with that additional time, and how that time could be used to drive community-centered policing for the entire police department.
I can start. So first of all, I think it starts with talking to your community. So the community expectations are different. And you know, I'm sure Chicago and some of the other cities, you might have a different cultural values from one neighborhood to the next. And so having those conversations and establishing what are the expectations when I show up, you know, we're going to speak to each other in this way, or just making sure to establish those type of norms first, and then making sure that those type of norms make it into policy, make it into procedure, make it into the things that when a police officer, so right now, to Chief's point, you might be judged on your stops and your citations. Let's start judging on, you know, the commendations that you get, or, you know, the things that you've established with the community that says, this is how I expect for my you know, law enforcement person to show up. This is what community safety looks like to me, and this is what they are doing it or they're not doing it in order to continue to build that trust. But you've got to have that conversation first, in my opinion.
You know, one of the things that works very effectively is to take away the responsibility for time. In other words, most officers work shift work, obviously. They work an 8-hour day, 8-hour time period during the day. And that's what they're responsible for. But if you shift that and make them responsible for whatever happens in their beat on a 24-hour time cycle, in other words, what happens and to work on those problems instead of just the problems for their time period, then you get a lot more interaction with people. You get individuals, you get cops that want to solve a problem instead of just respond to a problem. And you know, many problems, the vast majority of radio calls or calls for service are about things that take long-term solutions. And if you're just showing up to tell everybody to be quiet and I'll be back later, no. What you got to do is you have to, okay, what are the problems? Is there a young family here that needs some outlet, some positive outlets for their kids, so that they're not making noise with neighbors? Is there lighting that needs to be fixed? Is there whatever? You got to change the mindset. The thing that one of the killers of police relationships with the public is the reliance on time only. What you want to do is make everybody feel responsible for turf, not time. And turf is 24/7, 365.
We are very fortunate to have had you all here for this conversation today. And let's give a hand to our panelists for their informed and insightful conversation. And thank you to all of you for attending and for your great questions. We are hoping that this conversation will advance a dialogue within and beyond the Chicago Police Department that will create safer and more just communities for all. We appreciate your being here and your time and attention. And with that, I'll turn it back to Joyce Foundation for the next panel.
Great. Well, let's give our panel another round of applause. Okay. All right, so that was a great discussion. We have had quite a morning. We've heard from the next mayor and his vision for how we will move the city forward on policing and